Okay, well, thank you. And joining us this time, we have our first sort of technology focused SNA Speakeasy. Our guest is Tim Hornyak, who has been a guest on other SNA series in the past, such as What's the Rumpus? You were our guest a couple of times together, you and me in the studio, but this time we're doing our first sort of web-based talk between the two of us. And we have a topic which Tim has recently written about for CNBC, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is about
Topic
flying
about,
air taxis. Okay.
yes.
So first of all, why don't you just introduce yourself briefly, and why is it that you're doing this sort of technology-focused journalism?
Well, I've been a freelance journalist here in Japan for many years and been interested in technology for a long time. I wrote a book back in the day about Japanese robots, and so I've been interested in automation for years and years. And it's interesting to see how different areas of robotics are evolving. Japan has been more focused on sort of humanoids and has been playing catch up with the sort of drone and now flying taxis or flying car industry. But this article piqued my interest and got me interested in writing about it because of there's a lot of activity going on in this sector and it's happening around the world. But Toyota has recently invested in an American venture called Joby Aviation and put a bunch of money into that as one of the many, many players out there that are trying to get these flying taxis off the ground,
So to speak.
so to speak.
Well, before we jump into that, there may be some people who don't know about your book. So why don't you tell us what your book is and where they can buy it?
Yeah, the book is called Loving the Machine, The Art and Science of Japanese Robots, and it's available on Amazon. And it's about the question of why Japanese people love robots, particularly humanoid robots. And it boils down to a few things. You'll have to read the book to get all the answers on to that question. But one of them is if you look at science fiction, there is quite a presence of friendly robots in Japanese science fiction. One of them being Astro Boy, as opposed to in the West, where we have quite a number of scary, unfriendly robots, for example, the Terminator. And so this background of science fiction has helped raise several generations of Japanese engineers, roboticists, who went on to try to pursue the dream of having lifelike humanoid robots. And they've been building those over the last several decades. And so it's an exploration of not only the quest to build real robots, but where this drive comes from, both science fiction, culture, engineering background, a bit of the religious background as well in Japan. So it's a nice, quite an interesting brew of science, culture, and technology.
Okay, well, you mentioned science fiction. I think that segs very comfortably into what we're talking to do, because all of us are very familiar with the idea of flying cars or flying taxis, because of science fiction that we've been seeing all of our lives, whether it be the Jetsons cartoons or Back to the Future or Blade Runner or whatever. Flying cars have been a concept that we're all very familiar with. So. As you understand it, having researched this article, uh, how close are we to that kind of a vision as we stand here in 2020?
Well, it depends on what you mean by flying cars, of course. If it's something like, let's say, the Blade Runner type, where you can drive around on streets and then take off into the sky with it, that seems to be farther away than something that, for example, the ones you mentioned, like the Jetsons, where that seems perhaps more of a taxi style service. That seems to be closer. And so some companies are going to try to launch these, self-driving, self-piloting, autonomous taxi services within the next few years. They're building prototypes. There's a lot of money involved. And according to one analysis, the market could grow so big that it's worth $1.5 trillion by the year 2040. So that's huge. And you see a lot of these players, as I mentioned, like Toyota, Boeing, Airbus, etc. There's so many big brands in it. You gotta, have the feeling. You may get the feeling that out of all this effort, something's going to come out of it, and we're going to see some kind of successful service launching within the next few years.
I believe that Uber gave the date 2023 for the launch of their service. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So Uber's been teaming up with several other companies in its Uber Elevate project. And 2023 seems pretty ambitious now, seeing as how the global economy is tanking amid this coronavirus pandemic. So everything that I researched and wrote only a few weeks ago seems like science fiction now that we've kind of come back to reality with, after all, we are, biological entities, as we are painfully reminded now, and we're very vulnerable to pandemics, and the economy is very vulnerable because of that, and because the economy is key in driving these startups and investment into them that could push back these plans by several years.
Well, that would be unfortunate. So you've mentioned a few companies already. So about, as you understand it, I mean, obviously you may not have a completely comprehensive list, but who are the players on the field right now that are understood to be developing these flying taxi technologies?
Well, we talked about Toyota and Uber, and there's also Hyundai and Airbus and Boeing. There are companies like Porsche that are also involved as well. And so, there's so many brands from the automotive industry that are now linking up with the aircraft manufacturing industry and startups in between them. So the good thing is that these startups are not usually trying to go at it alone, but they're hooking up with these very experienced manufacturers who know how to do logistics, manufacturing, meet customer demands, and safety as well, which is a really important element in this whole equation.
And well, I mean, if you think about it, we've had airplanes for a century or something like this, and there have been, I think, in the distant past, various kinds of experimentation with flying cars and such. Uh, what is the what are the technologies that are coming together now that are making this a plausible thing that we'll see in the 2020s?
Yeah, so it's things like, battery technology. As these batteries become cheaper to make and they become more powerful in terms of their capacity, they can last longer. That makes it much more feasible to put them onto a sort of vertical takeoff and landing type craft and make it powerful enough to transport people at fast enough speeds and great enough range that it makes the whole thing realistic. So driving this has been the development of things like drones, and meanwhile you have other technologies like autonomous vehicles that have been deployed all over the world. They're in development everywhere and being tested everywhere. That takes a lot of artificial intelligence, know-how, and testing. And so the combination of various technologies, including batteries and AI, another part of the puzzle will be, of course, the regulations. That's not necessarily, well, it involves technology, but it's going to have to get the players involved with the regulators so that they can ensure all kinds of safety is required. And then you're going to have to get, it's not a technological thing, but I guess public support
Mm.
would be important for this as well. Like, are we really ready to have our skies filled with flying vehicles, flying taxis? That's a big question mark, I think.
Mm. Okay, well, let's take a look at two of those technologies separately. First of all, let's talk about the energy situation. So you mentioned that it seems to be electric or battery-powered vehicles that are at the forefront. Um, is it possible, for example, I mean, Toyota and some other Japanese companies are very big on hydrogen, and we have, century of experience with fossil fuels and things like this. So why is it, or is it the case that electric powered flying vehicles would be the ones that we're most looking at now?
Yeah, I think that these manufacturers and startups want to do a sort of clean break with fossil fuels. They want to make this technology appear not only safe and efficient and convenient, but clean. And so all of the platforms I looked at in my article for CNBC are electric, as far as I know. And I think it would make it more appealing to consumers. I don't think a lot of people are really interested in another form of mass transport, possibly, that is going to be, essentially dirty. Whether hydrogen could be used is another question. Hydrogen is still being, developed and rolled out for ground transportation, as you know. But in terms of, these autonomous flying air taxis, that's something that remains to be seen.
Well, you just mentioned autonomous. So to what extent are we envisioning these air taxi services to have drivers or to be driven by computers? And what would be the advantages or disadvantages of those approaches?
Well, I think it's going to be a staggered rollout or development curve where at the beginning you may have some platforms or vehicles that will have pilots and they're going to pilot people around. And then the next stage would be ground controllers, controlling the vehicle as it makes its flight, and or possibly just supervising it. And then finally, you would probably have minimal supervision on the ground and entirely autonomous rather operation on the part of the vehicle itself. So benefits to that would be, of course, lower cost if there's no pilot. And the safety factor, of course, would vary at the beginning. Perhaps it'd be safer to have a pilot, and then perhaps, you could take the argument from making, ground-based vehicles and cars autonomous. A lot of the, proponents say that these are safer than traditional, driven vehicles because there's no human error, in fact. So, you can look at things like helicopters. I don't know any stats for you, but it seems to me that I see more news about helicopter crashes than large aircraft, and often pilot error. We had the tragic death of Kobe Bryant recently in a helicopter crash that seems to be due to pilot error. So possibly autonomous vehicles, air taxis, could help reduce that kind of accident situation.
Mm. Well, other than having people on board, it sounds like this technology has a lot of overlap with drones. So, where do you see the convergence between the development of the drone industry and the development of this autonomous air taxi industry going?
Yeah, of course, if you just look at an air taxi, it looks like it could be in a sense, a giant drone that are big enough and powerful enough that people could get into from, two people or one person to I've seen concepts for, I think, up to five. And so, some of these would be taking drone-like propulsion methods with rotors, and then they would lift off vertically, and then they would switch to a sort of horizontal propulsion, winged style movement. And so it's almost like an outgrowth of the drone industry. They've demonstrated that drones can be safe and effective for transporting goods. That hasn't happened on a mass scale yet, but it's expected to be. And I think that it's a question of public acceptance too. Once the public is open toward receiving packages and things by drone, and then the next step would be larger cargo bundles perhaps, and then people as well.
Well, it sounds like our, in the 2040s and 2050s, when you and I are at the end of our rope, that the skies are going to be pretty filled up with little critters going here and there. So, what kinds of, challenges will that cause when, when you look up and you see 100 thingies going here and there around the skies of the city.
Exactly. I think, obviously we're going to have a great air traffic control system. Safety regulations are going to be really important. Public acceptance. Do we want to? I can only imagine it's going to be like as if we were, imagine that we were back in, say, the 1890s, where, everything would be carried by horse-drawn carriage here and there. And we would look into the future and see a world of superhighways and 18-wheeler trucks and large buses and cars everywhere, and traffic jams, and what would we say if we were in the 1890s? Would we welcome the way that our society will be utterly transformed by automobiles? Would we, or would we, and not to mention pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we're at a stage that the Victorians were in which we can look into our future and see our skies just full of flying taxis, drones, and other vehicles zipping on by. Do we want that? It's a question that the public has to ask and discuss. Maybe if it can be done in a regulated way where, only certain areas of the sky are full of these little taxis zipping by, like in the Jetsons and various science fiction movies. I don't think people want to look and just see swarms and swarms of these things overhead. That would just be like depressing, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk, since we're in Japan, and Japan is our technological focus. You mentioned Toyota. So tell us, what do we know so far about this Toyota Joby Aviation partnership? What's this all about, so far as we know?
Yeah, there are not a lot of details that have been released on about this, but Joby is a California-based startup, and it's one of these ventures like Lilium Aviation is another one in Europe that have developed an impressive prototype, and Toyota has partnered with Joby to advance its prototype, and I think that the advantage for a startup like Joby is that they can tap into Toyota's tremendous experience with mass production, quality control, efficient manufacturing, and all this sort of thing. So I think that in terms of Japanese industry, they've been playing catch up. Although Japan did have a history of drones for industrial use that stretches back a surprising way. Companies like Yamaha have been developing drones for agricultural use, for example, for a long time. But in terms of the consumer rather interest in drones, Japan was kind of playing catch up. China made great strides in developing consumer drones, and I remember last time I checked, there weren't very many players in terms of the Japanese consumer drone market here. So Japan is, I think, also doing the same with these flying taxis. It's just trying to hook up with existing players that are startups in America, perhaps Europe and other countries, other areas, and sort of bring the best of two worlds together by developing things together.
And do we know of any Japanese players at all other than Toyota, or is Toyota, so far as we know, the only one who's gone public on their interest?
There are other players, and a lot of them are smaller, however, and there's one that I visited not too long ago, last year it was, and it was a sort of smaller startup. They were exhibiting and at a big trade show. It was CTEC, and what all they had though was a sort of scale model of their flying taxi, and it wasn't much bigger than a desk. But the idea for theirs was it would be completely autonomous, and it would be able to take multiple passengers at a certain point, and they would sit around a desk and sort of have coffee and stuff and chat as they're being whisked through the skies, through various landscapes or whatever. So it was quite a fanciful scenario, but that seemed to be several years off from, I asked, when are you guys going to have a full-scale prototype? And the answer was not immediately available.
I see. So it sounds like Toyota is, as far as we know, the only serious Japanese player in this market or in this forthcoming market at the moment.
Certainly one of them, yeah. Yeah, and certainly got the biggest clout, I would say, in Japan. So there are various other ones that are trying to get attention, but the one that has, I think, the biggest chance of success right now because of its enormous share in the automobile market is Toyota.
Okay. So before moving it to the question and answer section for our patrons, is there any other final point you'd like to make about this issue that I haven't asked you about yet?
Well, I think it's a fascinating development. It's an example of future creep that sometimes it's interesting to ask, like, when is the future not the future and when is it the present? It's times like this when you see this kind of development happening right now. So, I again, I'd like to emphasize the question of whether this is something that society really wants. Is it inevitable? Do we have any choice here as members of the public? I wonder, talking about the Victorians again, if we would go back and talk to some of those people and talk about, the benefits and the disadvantages of the explosion in the 20th century of the automobile that's brought us so much good and bad. That's a really important issue that we really need to address before this happens.
Hmm. Okay. Well, at this point, we open it up to our patrons, those of you who might have questions.